Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, Episode 10. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all of our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. And you can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is John Cassara, an expert in anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, who previously worked in federal intelligence and law enforcement for 26 years, including as a CIA officer and a Treasury Department special agent. He's on the board of directors of Global Financial Integrity and the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies. His new book, titled China, Specified Unlawful Activities, examines CCP Inc., which he defines as big businesses that work with the Chinese Communist Party and transnational crime and money laundering. John, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. Now, we've had a couple of guests talk about this nexus of the CCP and money laundering. I'd really love it if you could talk first a little bit about what your career and life journey was that brought you to this subject, because not everyone starts out in life looking at this nexus between the Chinese Communist Party, money laundering, transnational crime. So a little bit about you and what brought you in, and then we'll follow that up with, hey, what brought you into this book? And let's talk a bit about that.
Sure. Steve, first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me, and a big thank you to the audience for listening in. I had a really interesting career. As you said, I was a covert case officer for the CIA during the height of the Cold War. I did that for about 5 years. Unfortunately, I had to resign because I wanted to marry a foreign national. I literally had to choose between the woman I loved and the job I loved. So I chose Christina, and we're now celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. After I left the agency, I joined the Department of Treasury and I became a special agent. And the bulk of that career was with U.S. Customs. Most people understand that customs is a little bit different than other customs services around the world, in that agents actually do investigations. Sure, they have the folks that, search your bags at the airport and that do an inspection and control at the borders. But customs special agents actually enforce more laws than the FBI does. And I did a lot of that with customs. I started off as a international arms dealer for a couple of years. I went overseas to our embassy in Rome for 6 years, headed up the first truly international anti-money laundering task force targeting Italian-American organized crime. I spent a number of years at Treasury's FinCEN working with financial intelligence. I did some work over the Department of State. And then finally, I ended my career at Maine Treasury after 9/11, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And since that time, I've continued to stir the pot, as they say, particularly pursuing my keen interests of money laundering and threat finance. How I started getting involved with China, it's been an evolution. As I said, I've worked anti-money laundering for well over 30 years, and it's only been about the last 10 or so that China has really come up upon my radar screen. And I first saw that when I was going overseas. I was doing a lot of training, delivering some assistance, some mentoring to law enforcement, intel, customs overseas in conjunction with our government. And I saw the growing Chinese presence, which alarmed me. And then I started hearing about, reading about, and actually witnessing some things that really took me aback. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about money laundering in general. I had a chapter in that book about what I call, quote unquote, China, today's biggest money laundering and threat. And that was the genesis for my new book, China Specified Unlawful Activities.
Well, you anticipated sort of what the next question was, how what the bridge was from the tremendous operational career you had, and then sort of jumping into writing a book. Not a project for the faint of heart. For a lot of people, they think, "Hey, I ought to write a book if I had an interesting life." It's actually kind of a heavy lift to actually write, edit, and get something out that people will read. But why don't you do kind of an intro for those who kind of are drawn in by the title of the book, the subject matter. What's kind of the key thrust, and what are they going to find when they crack the pages open and start walking through?
Well, communist China, it's an ideological, a military, an economic, a commercial, a high tech, an intelligence, a diplomatic rival of the United States and the West. But the People's Republic of China also has a growing um, role in transnational crime and money laundering. And most people aren't aware of that. So I looked at it from a law enforcement perspective because that's my primary background. I think it's really been the first time that's happened. And honestly, Steve, I think that's where they're most vulnerable. We can pick up on that later on. Um, the title of the book, China Specified Unlawful Activities, for those of in the audience that are unaware, specified unlawful activities, it's kind of a legal term, if you will. It means predicate offenses or those crimes that you can use to charge money laundering. So what I did, I looked at what I considered perhaps the top 12 transnational crimes in the world. And in almost every one, with one possible exception, China leads the world. And they are counterfeit goods, narcotics, intellectual property rights violation, human traffic and forced labor, wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, illegal fishing, illicit tobacco, trade fraud, arms trafficking, WMD proliferation, organ harvesting, and corruption. Okay, those are my top 12. The next thing I did is I totaled up China's involvement in all of these, as I call it, CCP Inc., Chinese actors, their involvement in all of this. And from my anti-money laundering perspective, I really worked to try to get a dollar value to attach to this criminal activity. And the number that I came up with, citing experts, is over $2 trillion a year. $2 trillion a year. Now, Steve, I think this is important, and I think it's important for the readers to understand that number has some significance because, from an anti money laundering perspective, we honestly don't know how much dirty money is out there. But the estimate we normally fall back on is what the International Monetary Fund said a number of years ago. It's about 2 to 5% of world GDP. So in very round numbers today, in 2023, that's about, say, $4 trillion a year. So what I'm saying is, if you want to look at it that way, and there are different ways to look at it, China, CCP Inc. is responsible for almost half, or perhaps more than half, of the money laundering in the year as measured by specified unlawful activities. And I know I've been going on. I'm just going to add very briefly. The next thing I did was to look at what I call Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies. Things like flying money, or Chinese underground banking systems, capital flight, gaming, real estate, offshores, this type of thing. And then I also talked about what I call Chinese-centric enablers, things like organized crime, influence operations, espionage, this type of thing. You add it all together, plus I talk a great deal about corruption and their growing overseas presence in the Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera, et cetera. When you add it all together, Steve, honestly, I went into this what I wanted to think was an open mind. I was just trying to develop probable cause, if you will, to make a case. and the totality of what they're doing is absolutely overwhelming. It's just shocking. And I've been around the world. I mean, I've been around the block. I'm not a naive guy, but what I found absolutely floored me.
Well, definitely you've done a great job of sort of defining the magnitude of the impact of these illicit activities. When you're going through the sort of menu of options and means that are in play, it sort of reminds me of what we used to think about when looking at North Korea, but at a smaller scale. But it's sort of like taking all of those activities and amplifying them China style to make them the biggest in the world. But it's just the number of people who just are usual consumers of news, policy commentary. They don't have this impression that the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China have basically become a North Korea times 10. The dominant narrative is the pop and sizzle of skylines and the major economic centers, a manufacturing hub, but there is this dark artery of things that are pumping through the bloodstream of the Communist Party of China. It's spilling out into the world like never before. Now, you sort of touched on kind of an analytical threshold and timing of, you kind of got an awareness of this about a decade or so ago, about this rising tide you're noticing of this illicit CCP activity. What do you think was the inflection point for where this sort of train began to drive out of the People's Republic of China? With the reform and opening period had been in full bloom for decades. There was an explosion of international investment and trade with the People's Republic of China. So this would be a relatively later add-on to China Inc. And this use of China Inc. in these illicit activities, as I say, probably comes as a surprise to some people. They think of it more of North Korea-like than China. So what can you maybe share about what you observed in your research and conversations and findings about what was changing about 10 or so years ago? I might add that's sort of coincident with the rise of Xi Jinping as the leader of the People's Republic of China. Is it him and his direction, or is there something else to the story?
Well, I'm glad you made that point, because I agree with you. It's about a simultaneous rise with Xi's ascendancy and the CCP's new ascendancy. And I think, again, from my background from law enforcement focusing on transnational crime, it would be one thing if China kept their criminal activity within the country, right? But
Yeah.
when they export it, and I think that their vehicle to exporting it was really accelerated with Xi's initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, because right now that BRI and Chinese presence is in about 150 odd countries. I mean, it's overwhelming, and they are taking their way of business with them, which is fine up to a point, but they're also taking some of their criminality with them, including their corrupt ways of doing business, lack of transparency, Chinese organized crime, unique, Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies, and this type of thing. And then there's also kind of a newfound assertiveness of China, and over those in that last 10 years or so, militarily and diplomatically, economically, commercially, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole thing has to be looked at, as a whole.
Yeah, well, you've definitely captured a trend that I think escaped a lot of media and government scrutiny during the rise of Xi. I think there has been some events in recent years that have sobered people up that he is truly a different kind of leader. And maybe this is the right time to sort of punctuate too. mean, we're talking about the top communist in China, and we're not talking about Chinese civilization. That's thousands of years goes back. We're talking about billions and billions of Chinese people who are not a part of China Inc. and are not a part of the Communist Party and aren't a part of the mafia that's going around the world and spreading corruption and illicit activities. But the Chinese people themselves know better than everybody else that this is the bread and butter of the Communist Party. They're the last to be shocked that if they've done it at home, of course they'd carry it abroad. I think it's sort of our expert class that's been reluctant to accept that there is this possibility, maybe because we had this dream that engagement was going to lead to normative changes over China, that we wanted to have maybe our missionary impulse believe that if we just engage and are friendly, that they'll see the virtues in what we're advocating, and they'll want some of those good things. But Xi Jinping and his brand of the CCP definitely tougher edge, and definitely more aggressive internationally, diplomatically and otherwise. But can you help us drill down a little bit into what are the kinds of entities what are the criminal enterprises that this money laundering is being done through? So people, when they think of money laundering, they probably think of mafias and drug cartels and things like that. What's the same or different about China Inc. when it comes to what modalities and entities they're using for this?
I think one of the biggest things to understand about China-centric money laundering is that it's varied. And that's what professional money launderers do. They don't just do one thing, it's varied. But one of the things, just to give you an example, which I think is extremely important, is something that is known as trade-based money laundering and value transfer. And I actually wrote a book on trade-based money laundering. I called it The Next Frontier in International Money Laundering Enforcement. I think that book came out about 2016. This is something that has long concerned me, even long before China. But China is the largest trading nation in the world, okay? So unfortunately, we've never systematically examined the magnitude of trade-based money laundering, although academics have kind of looked at it a little bit, but our government has never done it. The IMF has never done it. The World Bank has never done it. Think tanks have never done it. But if you look at the percentages of invoice fraud, primarily through over and under invoicing to transfer value, okay? It could literally mean hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars a year by China alone, okay? Trade-based money laundering is let's put it this way, trade fraud is a specified unlawful activity or a predicate offense to charge money laundering. Trade-based value transfer in all its varied forms can be a money laundering methodology. And it takes place in other forms of Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies like flying money or Fai Chen. Probably most in your audience have heard of Hawala, the underground Middle Eastern, South Asian financial system that came to prominence after 9/11. Flying money is basically the same system, although it's been around since the Tang Dynasty in the year 900. Back then, they didn't have currency, if you will, like we have it, but they used trade to settle accounts, to balance the books. They do that today as well. There's many, many other methodologies. Some are very, very sophisticated. We can talk about them if you want. For example, the Chinese use of telephone, mobile payment apps to launder money, drug money here in the United States and around the world, which completely stymies our criminal investigators. This is something else that we just kind of picked up on, say going back about 5 years, we saw it for the first time. Now, I don't want to speak for DEA, my former colleagues, but I think they will tell you that this is probably one of the most challenging forms of money laundering in the Western Hemisphere is the use of mobile phone apps, swaps as they call them, where they pick up drug money and they launder it for the cartels. The Chinese brokers do, and then through their phone apps send a like amount of money to their accounts in China, right, for a percentage. And this completely bypasses our financial transparency reporting requirements, which are our primary AML anti-money laundering countermeasures. I'll stop here because I've been talking too much. But
No,
anyway, I wanted to give you some examples.
all good, all good. So when we're looking at exactly who is doing what with whom and how, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and Mexican cartels? Are there other entities that are vital to understanding who's exactly doing what? Obviously, the drugs and human and other smuggling is something that people probably are pretty aware of when looking at the immigration debate and what's happened at the border. But this is a layer of complexity that is happening at the border, but also kind of around the border and through other ways. What further light can you shed on who's doing what with whom on this and how?
Well, once again, you've seen the growth over the last so many years, but Chinese criminal groups and suppliers, supply chains, consumers, Chinese consumers in mainland China, they and in other countries for that matter, increasingly play a very significant role in Mexican drug trafficking, and something that's overlooked. Talking about Mexico and organized crime is wildlife trafficking as well.
Mm.
Um, China is many people know is probably what is. It's the principal source of precursor chemicals for the fentanyl trade for Mexican criminal groups, principally the Sinaloa and the Jalisco cartels. But Mexican China wildlife trade is also becoming a mechanism to transfer value in the illicit economies, and once again bypass money laundering controls in China and Mexico, bypasses banks because they use wildlife to pay for drug precursors. It's basically almost kind of like a barter system, if you will, which is completely off the books. No financial intelligence is generated whatsoever, and they have huge markups for wildlife products between the harvest and the retail. Makes them just an ideal means to launder money and transfer value. Um, you know, just researching some of this once again, it was the examples and how this stuff really impacts what's going on in the illicit economies around the world, but specifically with Mexico. I mean, they're going after everything from sea cucumbers to jellyfish to sharks to totoaba. They use them for their bladders. To you know, it's a small little porpoise. I think it's called the vaquita. That gets caught up in these nets when they're going after everything else. They're fishing this stuff out to extinction, and the Chinese diaspora, say for example in Mexico, they're brokering the source of these products, and they're working hand in glove with the cartels. And unfortunately, I see some of the telltale signs of the presence of this presence here in the United States as well, and its role in fostering in criminality here in our country. It's very alarming.
When you're looking at what kind of entities are actually engaged in this kind of activity, are we looking at sort of the random sole member LLC or a small shop, or are they flying under the cover of state-owned enterprises or even some larger enterprises? When we look at the expansion of trade, there's of course a legitimate layer of that, but then underneath that, you could have people masquerading or maybe just acting as parasites on those entities engaged in this illicit activity. So, are we looking at kind of a Tony Soprano like thing of someone that's attaching their way into a legitimate business and burrowing in for their illicit purposes? Or is it sort of like these random sole operators that are out there that maybe are swimming in the same stream, but not really part of that broader trend of trade and investment?
I think a little bit of both. Definitely, you have Chinese organized crime, the triads, lesser extent the Tongs, whatnot. They're involved. They're involved with what you said. But from a law enforcement perspective, again, we know that. Okay, I don't think we're doing a very good job combating that, but we know it. I think what is more challenging are the ones that we would say kind of are under the radar screen. For example, students. There's a big problem, and I've read some reports coming out of the UK about Chinese students and how they are used as basically mules or smurfs or couriers, if you will. Sometimes they're not even aware of what they're doing. It's like, you're trying to help out some Chinese immigrants. Could you please open an account and deposit some money for us? Okay. Or you've got cash intensive Chinese businesses. It could be restaurants, it could be anything that's cash intensive, right? And they're the ones that are often approached by Chinese brokers working with the Mexican cartels, for example. Please take this drug money. They don't even say it's drug money. Please take this cash, right? Cash, and deposit it into your bank, into your revenue streams. They'll deposit it into the bank, no questions asked, because the bank's not going to file any reports on them because it's a cash intensive business. And then transfer a legit an equivalent amount, as I said, with one of these mirror swaps to a Chinese account back in the mainland. So they're using all kinds of people, all kinds of groups. It's very, very effective, and it's very challenging for law enforcement.
So we've done a little bit on the sort of diagnosis and sort of description side of the equation. Let's shift gears a little bit into what are we doing? What should we be doing? What tools do we have? What new tools do we need to be working on? Do we have the right kind of coalitions? Because obviously, when we're dealing with a problem at the scale that your research has described, this is enormous. This is not going to be a small problem that's addressed quickly with a few changes here or there. We're going to have human talent that is trained and equipped to be able to deal with everything from language to the methodologies here, and to pass for normal in several different kinds of cultures. We're going to have monitoring tools, and then we have to have the right priorities and policies in place. So I mean, that's a big elephant. How can you help us start digesting parts of this? What do we do about it, elephant? And your sense of where we are and where we need to go.
Well, thank you for that question. I write about that at the end of my book. I have a section called Steps Forward. I have a number of recommendations. And I was also honored about a month or so ago, was able to testify on Capitol Hill before the House Financial Services Committee. They were doing a hearing on fentanyl. They came up with a number of recommendations. I think I'll give you two. One of them is, I think we need a whole of government approach, which calls out for a strategy, a USG strategy to go after Chinese transnational crime and money laundering. So we need to get all of the government involved, meaning the appropriate government agencies. the Bureau, the DEA, DHS, ICE, regulatory agencies, Treasury, state, et cetera, they all need to come in and say, okay, we agree on it. We have a problem here. What can we as a government do to combat Chinese transnational crime and money laundering, because it affects each and every one of us as Americans? I think as part of that, I would like to see, this would be another recommendation, back in the heyday of say, when anti-money laundering was just taking off, back in, say, the 80s and 90s, we came up with a number of task forces. And we had task forces, for example, focusing on Italian-American organized crime, right? I would like to see the same type of thing kind of reconstituted to go after China, okay, Chinese transnational organized crime in this country, and then use our tremendous law enforcement and intelligence networks liaison overseas to help our counterparts, our friends and allies, going after Chinese transnational crime and money laundering, and it affects their countries as well. One thing I would emphasize again, it's like, okay, we could say, well, let's just give more money to the FBI. Well, I'm not even going to go down that road about what the FBI is doing today or not doing today. But when the FBI is looking at China, their primary focus is counterespionage, okay, and intellectual property rights violations, which is, and both are extremely important, don't get me wrong, but that's the Bureau's priority. I keep going back to, you cannot focus on one or two crimes. If we focus, Jay, just on fentanyl, we're missing the big picture here. We have to attack the totality of everything. For example, those 12 specified unlawful activities are all deserving of our time and efforts, as well as those Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies. So if we give all our resources to the Bureau, because that's what the Bureau does, they're going to just say, okay, more emphasis on counterespionage and IPR theft, but they're not going to really focus on everything else. And that's a big mistake.
Yeah, well, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my core takeaway is, number one, comes as a shocker, you have to make this a priority. And that comes at a leadership level, from the president and the cabinet down, congressional leadership, and sort of people in the private sector. Absolutely. Also talking about this and acknowledging this as a major strategic challenge to not just our way of life, but our way of doing business. So, I mean, it's an economic threat, it's a national security threat, but really at a leadership level, this has to be a priority. And to me, you sort of sold that this ought to be a priority by defining the scope. I mean, when you're talking about, $2 out of possibly $4 trillion of this being China tied, just grinding through the system, that should almost make itself a priority. So, I mean, number one, we've got to make this a priority, or no task force is going to be able to meet the moment. Right. I guess so. The other thing it sort of echoes in my mind is the truism of follow the money. All of us want to stop the fentanyl. All of us want to stop human trafficking and other kinds of abhorrent behaviors that are attacking our communities. And are bad for the human suffering that is involved in those systems. But it's kind of hard to do that, and if you don't take the money oxygen out of the equation. And so, I think we've always looked at this money laundering thing as coming out of the organized crime world. And then, especially after 9/11, it got into the counterterrorism world of using international financial tools to meet a national security priority. I think we're really at the beginning of a conversation of what role does illicit finance and just this financial network play in the new strategic challenge of our time of China under Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. So I just would double accentuate that I think that there's a newness to this, but it's been growing for a long time. You don't get to this scale by starting yesterday.
Right.
And that the centrality of money laundering is much more important than a lot of us that just are swimming in the usual flow of policy analysis and U.S.-China relations and talking about things in the news might realize. Have I arrived at the right conclusion based on our
Absolutely.
conversation so far?
Absolutely. I endorse everything you said. Outside of crimes of passion, for example, murder committed in a jealous rage or something like that, criminal organizations, and even nation states commit crime for money. Money is the motivating factor. You say, it's one of the seven deadly sins, if you will. It all comes down to money. How often have we heard that expression before? And we've talked a great deal over the years, these 30 years I've been in anti-money laundering, about, going after the money, but we've never really done it successfully. We have spent an inordinate amount of time going after the product, for example, drugs or stolen cars or, weapons or whatever it is, or people, meaning, the heads of the cartels and this type of stuff. But we're not doing successfully is going after the money. There's a lot of reasons for that. The short answer is, and I've been in the federal bureaucracy, so I can say this, it's easier to go after the product and the people over the money. It's easier. And you're going to get rewarded bureaucratically faster and easier if you have a press conference with mounds of fentanyl on the table, as opposed to taking 2 to 3 years to try to make a long-term complex money laundering investigation. But that's the direction we need to go. And I think you're right. I think we're started to head in that direction now.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed that we are, in fact. Sometimes the warning signals are flashing and we say we see them, but hopefully the big enterprise that is our national leadership is catching the vision, and also some of our partners around the world. One element that we haven't taken a dive into yet that I want to address before our time goes is just sort of this analytical challenge of who's really driving this and to what levels of leadership does this go inside of China? So we know that there are national and international criminal elements. We know there's bad actors. We know there's corruption that occurs in big organizations and big governments, and China is the definition of big government. But in your research, have you been able to kind of arrive at some kind of an assessment of how high up does this go? Is this something that you sort of have a feel or evidence that it's at leadership levels of the Communist Party that they've gone in this direction? Or are we really just talking about sort of bad actors and opportunists that are popping along in a system that's just kind of going gangbusters and dealing with things around the world, and they're just the parasite along for the ride?
Once more, an excellent question. It's something that I wrestled with. I think for certain specified unlawful activities, for example, intellectual property rights theft, we know the CCP at the highest levels is behind that. Same thing with, say, proliferation, WMD, this type of thing. This can only be done at the highest levels of the CCP. We know that because we know Chinese intelligence services are all over that. Their military services are all over that. So this directly comes from the CCP. Others look at, say, for example, illicit tobacco, or even, say, counterfeiting of goods, all right? Huge criminality within China. But once again, they are exporting this. China obviously is the largest counterfeiter of goods in the world. China is also the largest producer of illicit tobacco in various forms in the world. So you'd say, well, China does not really crack down on it. Well, why don't they crack down on it? Because it provides employment, right? Because it's a growing industry. It fuels their economic, renaissance, all this kind of stuff. It's not in their interest to crack down on it. Same thing with like fentanyl. They could crack down on it if they wanted to. They choose not to. We could go into those reasons as well. Same thing with advertising for their illicit product. It's online. They use social media. They could crack down on it if they want to. They're very good at cracking down on, websites and social media that they find objectionable to, but they choose not to do so. So remember, CCP, China, it's a command state. They can do what they want to do. That's the bottom line. They choose not to.
Yeah, well, it seems to be a part of a piece on a number of different challenges where, yes, if you have a leader that can literally deplatform people for posting an image of Winnie the Pooh, they've got to know that this other stuff is moving through their networks also. And they seem very happy to export problems to other parts of the world, whether they mean it intentionally to undermine us, our culture, our society, our system. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I tend to believe they do. But there's almost a degree of implausibility that they don't know. And they certainly have tools at their disposal to crack down when they so choose. So I guess we're going to scratch our heads a little longer on why they don't crack down on this. I think we'll all have our theories, and probably mostly right, that it serves their strategic interests to make the money, help employ their citizens, and to sow division, dissent, and distrust out in their competitors around the world, at the very least. But John, I want to thank you for an excellent and fruitful conversation. I want people to know where to follow you and get a copy of your book. Where can the audience go to follow your work and keep up with what your comments are on where things are happening today?
Well, thank you, Steve. If anybody would like to get more information, go to my website, www.johncassara.com. John Cassara, CASSARA.com. My latest book, China Specified Unlawful Activities, CCP Inc., Transnational Crime and Money Laundering. It's available on Amazon, both the print version and the e-versions. And I'd appreciate all the support I could get. I'm doing this because I have a passion. I'm trying to get people to become more and more aware. And I need your help to get the word out. So once again, Steve, thank you and for your efforts and the very kind invitation to participate in the show today.
Well, thank you very much, John. Now, for our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and thank you to John Cassara for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.